Congressman West, former Army Lieutenant Colonel, and he is certainly not one to beat around the bush. He tells you exactly what he thinks. And tonight, he has something to say about President Obama's new strategy for a leaner military. The strategy cuts the military budget and makes our military leaner. Congressman West joins us. Good evening, sir.
Good evening. How are you doing, Greta?
Very well. Today, the President made a historic trip over to the Pentagon to tell us about the plans with the Defense Secretary Panetta on the plans about our military. I know you don't like the idea, so tell me why.
Well, one of the things that I'm very concerned about, you did talk about a historical precedent of the President going to the Department of Defense, the Pentagon. We're not talking about a coherent national security strategy. What the President laid out is very dangerous. It really does show an incompetence in understanding national security strategy. We did not talk about how we go forth on this 21st century battlefield, the ability to engage, deter, and strike the enemy when necessary. We cannot sit around and say that we won't fight a second combat operation because the enemy has a vote in this. And what we need to be able to do is sit down and look at our geographical areas of responsibility and start examining for the next 10 to 20 years and come up with the requirements, the capability, and the capacity that our military needs to be able to meet these threats. Because if we continue to go down this path, after World War II, we gutted the military to such a degraded state that the 1st Army Battalion that showed up on the battlefield in Korea was absolutely decimated, and that was Task Force Smith. And I don't want to see that type of thing happen to my friends and also one of my relatives that's still serving in the military.
You know, it's in listening to the President today and the Secretary, I was sort of reminded of the early part of the Bush administration when I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld spoke about transforming the military, making it a little bit lighter in terms of less boots on the ground and being more prepared from the air and from the sea. Am I right in that this mirrors a little bit what Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld had planned, and then of course 9/11 happened and everything changed?
Yeah, exactly. I think that what you saw was Secretary Rumsfeld believing that the initial means by which we went into Afghanistan could be a new model for the United States military. And that's one of the problems that we tend to have, is that we believe in a one-size-fits-all after what was a success in one combat theater of operation. That does not transition to another combat theater operation. And that's why it's so important that you have the respect for the generals that are over there that understand this battlefield, and you allow them to go in and develop the threat assessments and come back to you telling you what is the capability and capacity needed.
Do you think though that the President, I mean, I assume, maybe I'm wrong, but were military leaders not part of this new plan or this new strategy going forward? I mean, are you hearing from people at the Pentagon or former colleagues that they were ignored in the whole discussion about which direction to take our military?
Well, I can tell you that that is probably the case. I have heard some ruminations to that effect. And also when the President stands up and says, this is the guidance that I gave. The guidance that he gave was not really oriented toward how we can have an effective strategy to contend with the threats that are emerging all across the world. It was more so based upon a budget analysis. Look, Greta, one thing that troubles me is the fact that Mahmoud Ahmadinejad next week will be traveling through Latin America and South America and coming up through Central America. We know that there are some concerns about Iran establishing missile bases in Venezuela. We're on the crux of having what could be a 21st century Cuban Missile Crisis that could threaten us right down here in South Florida. We cannot disengage and leave our most staunch ally in the Middle East, which is Israel, but yet we see what was called an Arab Spring that began a year ago is now turning into an Arab winter. So those are the type of things we have to evaluate. We haven't even talked about the emergent threats that North Korea could present now that they've had a transition of leadership. And of course we know that China is developing its strategic Navy and Air Forces.
Congressman, thank you. I got to go. Thank you, sir. I hope you come back. Coming up, Tea Party Express chair Amy Kramer says